Okay, so our third and last presenter for today's session on education is Ariel Schwartz from UT Austin. And so she's graduating and going to be starting a postdoc at the University of Pennsylvania. But if anybody's interested in her presentation and topics and areas of research, well, she's still on the job market after the postdoc.
That's right. Thanks for the plug. I'll be looking for a job soon. So thank you very much for having me. Today I'm presenting work with a couple of co-authors, one of my colleagues from Maria's Libraries, two of the developers of the technology, one of the technology tools that I'll talk about today, and then one of the local partners. She's based in Uganda now at Makerere University, but at the time of this project, she was based in Kenya at one of the community libraries with which I partner pretty closely. So me, I'm at the University of Texas at Austin, and the university kindly paid for this trip, so I should acknowledge that, and I really appreciate that. For the purposes of this session, I'm wearing my practitioner hat a little bit to describe some work that I'm passionate about and proud of, but I want to describe to you some deep frustration and an attempt to use theory to understand some practical challenges that took place during the implementation of an intergenerational reading program. So at Maria's Libraries, we're committed to community libraries as venues for development and promote libraries as places for supporting provision of access to information services and reading services. And so we view the librarian as a change agent. Okay, so Maria's Libraries' job is to support this person and help them do their work better. So for example, this woman all the way on your right in the white dress is Joyce. She's a librarian, and she's participating as a leader of this reading program that we implemented. And these are her students and the children of her students in this program. But so many NGOs that we work with and many of other organizations attempt to support this community librarian position and community library as an institution. In particular, Maria's Libraries generally partners with community libraries that were initiated and continue to be maintained by the communities in which they operate. So the librarian is a member of the community and is enacting a mission or a mandate that the community itself has generated. But there's lots of other organizations interested, external partners, foreign donors, organizations like Maria's Libraries also support the community librarian role, and then foreign donors also support NGOs like my organization to do this. And there's a formal way to understand this relationship that my paper describes, and I'm not going to go into it too much, but it applies a principal-agent model. And so we understand the community as a principal who sort of establishes a mission or a mandate and empowers and entrusts an agent, and in this case that agent is the community librarian, to enact that mission. And Maria's Libraries also sees itself as an agent of this community-led change. So Maria's Libraries is an agent that's trying to support the primary agent of the principal, which is the community, who has this mission of providing information services and reading services to the community. And I like this model because it connects the really narrow, focused activities of the community librarian with the ecosystem in which he or she operates. So it connects far-flung stakeholders such as funders. And the observable indicators of this relationship, as best shown by the model, are contracts. So the community librarian might have a established contract with the library where he or she works. Joyce does. Actually, she's paid. Not all librarians are paid, but there's often a job description and an agreement with the community. And in the same way, NGOs' relationships with foreign donors are made explicit in funding contracts, and those come with obligations. But it seems that all of these stakeholders are committed to some principles, and those 3 principles are pretty key to my organization's mission, as well as all of these other stakeholders. And the first one is grassroots development. This is described in a bunch of different ways by different stakeholders. Some say locally led development. Maria's Libraries uses the term demand-driven, so having problems arise from the community, and having solutions be participatory and inclusive from within the community. And then we care about implementations that feature continuous improvement. So the idea being here that design is iterative, and these sorts of principles align with human-centered design principles and user-centered design principles. So I'm telling a story here about work that adheres to these principles, but which are embedded in a funding structure that undermines, at certain critical points, my ability and my organization's ability to implement these principles that I believe in and which all the other stakeholders in the context also seem to believe in. So the backstory here is that one of our partner libraries, excuse me, in Elingatawas, said that the mothers in their community wanted to help their little children prepare for school, but they didn't know how, because they didn't feel that they had the literacy skills to do so. And the prior presentation aligns very well with this. Non-universal access to free primary education, and exclusion on secondary education based on the exams is very common, and results in a lot of adult low literacy, among other reasons. So we piloted an attempted solution in 4 libraries in Kenya, in Elingatawas, Garissa, Busia, and Lamu. So we're really proud of the process, and we're proud of the outcomes. So we developed a program that had these features. It was a training program for parents to do early childhood development at home, and it was administered at the library level to parents with low literacy. And we used and developed multi-language storybooks to implement this program. And this was a big deal for the program, just because the language of instruction in Kenya is in English and in Swahili, and most of the community members that were participating in the communities that we work with didn't speak English or Swahili at home. So they were raised reading or speaking different languages. So even if they had books in their home languages, they would still be at a disadvantage when they got to school. But they didn't have books in their own languages, generally. So the program varied a little bit by site, and it featured continuous improvement based on feedback from the participants and the decisions of the librarians. And it featured what we considered some major successes from the standpoint of the library. So it increased mothers' confidence, skill, enjoyment, and frequency in reading to their kids, and it increased children's reading skills and also pleasure reading. And in the communities that we work with, pleasure in reading was a major indicator for the libraries that the community cared about. Especially, you hear the term a lot of time that they are interested in generating a reading culture in Kenya. So that was sort of a main goal. So we developed a replication manual, and this program's been replicated without our involvement in a couple different places, and we're excited that next summer the World Bank is doing an RCT that's inspired by this program. So like I said, we're proud of the process and proud of the outcomes, but we had a couple of major challenges that a technology tool we thought could address. So the biggest problem was that this program excluded the least literate parents. So it required that parents had at least some literacy, even if it was latent and they weren't comfortable with it, but we couldn't include everybody. So that was sort of a big problem. Second, books were in English, Swahili, and at least one mother tongue. You can see in this book, coming from Busia, Kenya, It's also in 2 mother tongues, in Teso and Samia. And so you can see that the words on the page get really squeezed out as you add additional languages. And then these are local stories, but not all the stories were printed in all the local languages. So in Elengatawas, as they were reading this story, the mothers had to still translate the stories to their kids as they were reading to them. And then finally, the books were flimsy. All the participants wanted multiple copies to give to their friends, and we just were too cheap and poor to do that sort of thing. And we're not a publishing house, so this was a real challenge. The excitement that the books drove resulted in this new challenge. So we saw an opportunity to use technology to enhance this existing program, and we thought that we would create some digital books with certain special features. This table describes 3 use cases. Don't panic, it's in the paper if you can't read it. So imagine 3 cases. So there's 3 users. The first one is a reader, and that's the primary user. And their intended purpose is to read these books. And then there's 2 administrative functions, which ultimately might be used by a librarian or a teacher to translate existing stories into new local languages and to create new stories in general. And story creation is a feature of this program that was exciting for us, but not really a central part of this paper. So we produced 2 tools, and the first one featured some of the critical back-end features, but lacked the user-friendliness and attractiveness that would have made this particular pilot that you see here in Busia successful. So we went back to the drawing board and produced a second tool entirely oriented to test the user experience. So, and the theory of change on the 3 critical functions of the tool that we cared about for the reader. And those 3 critical functions were A, read to the reader. So no literacy would be required, so the story would read it aloud. And that's a very common feature on digital books that exist today. Second is multiple languages. So we hoped that the book would be able to include as many languages as there was a community to read them, but that they would feature space on the page so that the image would be shown. And then finally, we thought it was critical that the reader be able to toggle among languages. So actually, and that be page by page, so actually you can see the stars in the sky feature different languages. You tap on a star, you get a new language. You can compare what it looks like, English, Swahili, Swahili, Samia, that sort of thing, and have each language be spoken aloud. So this also featured some challenges. This was a really rewarding project, and all the stakeholders felt like we were participating in a really well-designed, user-centered process, and we seemed to be doing good work. We were proud of the work that we were doing, but there were some deep frustrations among the program designers locally in Kenya and out of Kenya, specifically that seemed to rotate around the gatekeeper role that Maria's Libraries seemed to have found itself in this project. And why were we gatekeeper? Well, partly it's because we took the lead on the project, and specifically on the lead on administration of funding for this project and finding a developer for this project. Donor funds for this project flowed through us. Some of the funds were raised on Global Giving without conditions, but there were plenty that were conditional, and that generated some demands from us to our beneficiaries all of a sudden that required accounting and reporting and sticking to timelines, which we wouldn't necessarily have demanded if we had our funds unrestricted. We're the only organization in this group interacting directly with the developer. So the developers had never come to Kenya, and they had never spoken to any of the users who we had participated with. But this is a very exciting opportunity for us. This office of the Oregon State University Libraries had a mission to develop programs specifically for these sorts of purposes. And so they had the expertise and the interest and the motivation and the willingness. And so they were the right partner for this anyway. And so all the stakeholders were physically far apart, and all our communications were mediated by technology, except for when Maria's Libraries was physically in Kenya, which was quite a bit. And so especially this lead on the administration of funds led Maria's Libraries to experience a real tension. At the beginning of this talk, I described Maria's Libraries as feeling as an agent of the community librarian, an agent of the community, because we care about demand-driven work. But the funding structure and the funding obligations means that we were also an agent of the funder, in addition to the communities that we cared about. And even while the funders cared deeply about our guiding principles, including demand-driven development, as individuals and as representatives of their institutions, they still operated in a system by which the arrows that you see represent not only conceptual support, but funds and other efforts, and real contractual obligations that imposed hierarchical authority, where everyone is committed to horizontal power share. So all of our stakeholders' belief systems implied that we were all agents of community-led mandates. But conditional funding flows and the contractual obligations that went with funds sort of squeezed out the community as the principle in practice and replaced the mandate, the institution of mandating as the funder and the agents of the funder, and that's us. So how can the principles of community-driven development be maintained and be consistent with the funding structures that we all operate in? And I don't have a lot of great recommendations about this. I think the first thing that we can do is participate in open discussion with our funders about these challenges and address them in planning and make demands about the wording of contracts, which are not easy because they're used to standardized contracts, but the specific reporting structures that we adhere to constrain our ability to manage this user-centered, continuous improvement, cyclical development of continuous improvement. And so in my organization, we're often faced with a requirement for log frame reporting, whereby we have to come up with social outcomes and then identify outputs for every single outcome, and then identify monthly performance indicators for each one, and then show. It makes it very hard to implement a user-centered implementation at the same time as establishing at the beginning these sorts of log frameworks. And then finally, probably the hardest solution is for NGOs to implement alternative funding sources with non-restricted funds. And I don't know if that's possible, but I have hope. Anyway, stay tuned.
All right, so we have time for questions. You?
Yeah. Eno Bhattacharjee, University of South Florida. A key component of principal-agent theory is the concept of information asymmetry between the principal and the agent. And I'm talking about things like moral hazard and adverse selection and the design of contracts to overcome these asymmetry problems. Now I'm wondering, how is information asymmetry figured in your description of the model between the donors and Maria's Libraries?
Yeah, it's a great question, and they exist in any principal-agent relationship. I think they're not a central so information asymmetries leads to a problem whereby the principals can't monitor the agents, and don't have a good sense of whether the agents are acting properly on their behalf. So this is a major problem in principal agent modeling, and this exists in every project that we've worked in, and this one in particular. I don't think it's a central feature of this particular issue, but we are constantly encountering, things like fudged receipts and things like that. And in my other work, where I study community health work and their use of mobile phones, actually, I think there's a huge role that technology plays in reducing information asymmetries in that work. But I don't think it's a central feature of this particular work. But I'd be very curious to hear how you think it would play in.
Hi, Ariel. Thank you for your talk and your
Wave. I don't know where you are.
Oh. Hi, I'm Susan Weich. I'm at Michigan State University. And this point about how funding agencies and their requirements are really counter to this human-centered, user-centered design process is really well taken. And I thank you for sharing that. I had one question about the language use in the books that you were talking about. I see a lot of evidence of code switching in Kenya, and I wonder how you accounted for that in the book, or if just presenting the single languages diminished that practice, or did you struggle with that, or any comments about how you dealt with that in your research?
Yeah, so that's actually a really big challenge, and so the books that we generated were generated by the participants of the program, the mothers who were participating in the program, so it was very exciting for them. And the librarians managed the generation of stories and then the translation of stories into all the languages that the participating mothers spoke. And in Busia, for example, the book featured, it was about a hare and a tortoise and a hyena who were planting groundnuts, and there was a djembe in the story, which is basically like a hoe. It's it's farm tool, but it's just called a djembe. And there was a huge debate over whether it should be in all, just referred to as a djembe in all of the translations, or if it should be translated properly. And in a Luo area, which we did a later translation of a Somali story that featured a fox, I believe. They were like, look, we don't have foxes here, and we don't have the word for fox. And that may be true, or it's possible that the group of elders who were participating in the translation just didn't know the word for fox. I don't know. I don't know the answer to those questions. But sometimes we bring these challenges to linguists. But for the purposes of these books, we don't really mind, as long as they're thinking about what the words mean and how to read them, and that they're engaging and interesting. So as a librarian, a supporter of libraries, this is sort of a freedom that we have to just be like, it's okay.
Okay, we have time for one last question.
Yeah. My interest here was in reading, how do you get reading to children? So I'm a little confused by the principal agent problem. I didn't see the connection to how to improve reading, but that added to that. My question is, did you use ebooks here?
Yeah, so for
I think that's a very important thing.
Yeah.
So if you can illuminate on that, was it all ebooks?
Mm-hmm.
And a little bit
in
more
fact,
on
that's what you're looking at right now.
Yeah. Was it all ebooks, or was
No,
it
the original program was all physical books. And we introduced ebooks to solve a couple of key challenges that had been addressed in the original program. But even in the piloting of the digital books that we used, we continue to use physical books as an introduction to the program, and then we introduced digital books that weren't our digital books, and then we introduced our books. So there was sort of a progression. And we're not advocating for eliminating the physical books in the program, actually. We really, that's a really good part of the program.